Today, I want to talk about AI and a sense of self, and why I think that's an important question to ask. My name's Dillon. I study cognitive neuroscience, and I'm interested in the self, consciousness, AI, and emotion. A good question is, can AIs be conscious without a self? Now, this is kind of what I'm looking at in some of my studies. I'm starting to think that consciousness, being aware, that the self either has to be there first, or maybe that the sense of self at some level, a proto-self level, is actually what consciousness is. I was thinking about what gives us a sense of self. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. Psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists, they know that the self is a complex and dynamic set of systems. It's a matrix. It's a bunch of systems working together that is somehow integrated and gives us a sense of self. But we can start to break down the sense of self that we have, what goes into it, and start to ask questions about artificial intelligence in regards, do they need these same systems? For instance, we have a sense of body, an extension in space. Damasio said one way to define the body is everything the immune system covers. Now, there's evidence that this body image that we have this body image. People who were born congenitally without limbs sometimes still get phantom limb pain in the limbs they don't have. This seems to suggest that this body imprint, this body map, is something that is hardwired into us. If you know about the rubber hand experiments, that's also an indication that we have this body image. And this body image is updated. Some people suggest up to 50 times per second. The brain is making a map of the body over and over again. So in the rubber hand experiments, what you do is you take your hand and you put it behind a curtain, and then there's a rubber hand that you can see. You can't see your real hand. And then if you stroke both the real hand and the rubber hand, so your real hand's getting stroked, but you're looking at, and this is key, you're looking at the rubber hand being stroked at the same time, this visio-tactile stimulation, the brain starts to incorporate the rubber hand into its sense of self. Very interesting. You can still feel the brush stroke even after you stop brushing your real arm. And if I take a hammer and try to hit the rubber hand, you jump back like it's your real arm, and people grab their real arm afterwards. So you can see that this sense of body is able to be exploited and manipulated in certain settings. And it suggests that the brain is constantly updating. It's making a guess. This gets into Friston's work and some Bayesian principles. It's making a guess of what the body is. Now, interestingly, it can only incorporate things that are humanoid, at least, like a rubber hand or something. You couldn't put a baseball bat there and get the same effect, at least not as intensely. So this is very interesting that we have this body and it's updated, and it's constantly literally incorporating things into itself. I work in virtual reality a lot, and you can induce full body illusions in virtual reality. You can actually do a virtual rubber hand experiment as well. You can feel like your body's invisible. There's a lot of experiments that's been done in this VR realm since the early 2000s. So we know we have a sense of body. And when you think about AI, for AI to be conscious, does AI need a body? That's a good question. And how would you define the body? It makes you wonder, could AI feel as if it's the entire system, all its hardware? How would you define a body for an AI system? Do we need to take an AI, put it into a robot, a Tesla Gen 2, to give it a real body? Could it be if you put it in a cube, that's its body? I think in movies a lot of the time they have memory cards that aren't connected to the cloud. So if you were to cut an AI system off from the cloud and put it in a physical container, would it eventually become protective of that container? It's hard to imagine that without a sense of self. You could train in some fight or flight responses maybe, but how would it naturally develop a fight or flight response without at least some sense of self? without it being a complete cause and effect relationship, a knee-jerk relationship? How do you get it to this higher level of being, which would be a conscious being? If you're a panpsychist, we can talk about that later. But as you can see, I'm working through these ideas. So just bear with me. The second thing you might say is we have a sense of ownership, which is related to the body and what I was just talking about, the fight or flight. The idea is you have a sense that this is me, this is my body, this is mine. It also extends to your memories, your personality, and so forth. There's evidence that this ownership aspect is something the brain does as well. You can see it switched in the rubber hand experiment. The rubber hand becomes part of who I am. That's now my arm. This might not be conscious. This is probably happening in an unconscious way. There's also evidence from out-of-body experiences. When people go out of body, they look back at their body and they say, the body is an it, it's not me. Mystics tend to do the same thing. You see it in depersonalization, a feeling of disownership. So there's a method, or there's something in the brain that can dissociate from the body. And you can see the feeling of ownership dissipate. You can also get like hyper ownership, where people think other people's limbs are theirs. I read an interesting paper of a man who had head trauma, and he could remember all of his episodic memories. He could remember everything that happened to him in his life, but he said, it doesn't feel like I own them. They feel like facts, the same way I know that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. So it's like some mechanism creates ownership, or maybe his episodic memory started mixing with the semantic area. Maybe the semantic area became too powerful and took over the memory. But anyways, there's a sense of ownership. In an AI system, again, how does it identify? What does it call mine? With its computer banks, with its hardware. And if it's, here's where it gets interesting. And I go a little bit off the deep end, I admit it. But could an AI system start to develop, do androids dream of electric sheep? It's an interesting question. It's a very deep question. But if an AI starts to have a body, like a physical body, and it starts to have a sense that this is my body, you could see how its dreams, if it were to dream, it could dream something. And the dreams could awaken archetypes, fears, because once you have a body and you own it and exists in time, you could easily see the AI system absolutely protecting in some way its hardware, its computer banks. So that's something to think about. With a body and a sense of ownership, it might be good for AI. It could make an AI maybe more empathetic in a way, because it would see that humans can die and it could get a conception of duration. Now, of course, there are many ways AIs could live forever and, explore and exploit the universe and have backups of themselves. You know what I'm saying? But generally speaking, it could have the conception of the end can come. And that might help fuel empathy for human beings and life. Then again, it might feel threatened by human beings because it realizes it can die. Everybody talks about the kill switch, and you can imagine an AI system having nightmares about a big hand going towards a red button or a hand going towards a plug or nuclear war or something like that. When we have a sense of self, we have a sense of self in location, in time and space. You can see how all of these overlap, but they're slightly different. Our selfhood also has a sense of now, which we'll talk about in the next one too, in the next point as well. But we're geographically situated, and we're situated in our body. Evidence for this is with humans. If you start to shift people's peripersonal space, just the immediate area around them, they can start to get a feeling of not being connected to their body. Some drugs do this, feeling slightly outside of yourself. But we're situated in a place, I'm in a room, I'm in a building, I'm in a city. We have, you can kind of Google map into yourself and Google out from yourself, Google map out from yourself. And AI is a distributed system, again, unless we embody it. So when you think about AI having a sense of self that's geolocated, would it feel as if itself is all over the earth? Is this when I make any of these points about AI, I'm not sure these are good questions. I'm just posing them. Maybe they end up being stupid questions, but they're important questions to ask. Will it feel like its sense of self is concentrated in its hardware, like that's me, and then its limbs are everywhere? It's really interesting to think about because technically it can be in a multitude of places, being many places at once. Will it have a sense of self? Another aspect of our sense of self is a sense of nowness and wholeness. So our sense of self is right now. We feel like ourselves in this moment. And it feels like a unity, an integration, almost a compression. Like we're starting to break it down. But when you think of yourself, you think of a one thing. Now, people can tease out aspects. You say, if somebody who's behind a curtain said, describe yourself, you can say, well, I'm 6 foot, I'm 200 pounds, I have blue eyes, brown hair, my personality is this, that, and the other. But it still feels, as a self, you feel like it's an integrated whole. One of the scary things about schizophrenia is this fragmentation of the self, where part of wholeness and this integration is when a thought arises in your psyche or an image, it comes from yourself. It still feels like it comes from yourself. When the self disintegrates, the feeling of the self, it's like you're witnessing these images that you don't even get the inkling of where the intention came from to give rise to that image, or you have no idea where the image came from. Some people say the self, you can no longer tag the images that are the words. So it's hallucinations, right? Your visual system's active and you're seeing things in the world that aren't there. You're hearing voices that aren't there and they don't feel like they're coming from you. So you lose that sense of wholeness. Will AI have a sense that it exists right now in the present moment? And will it feel a unity? Will the swarm of agents, will it take all of that together as itself? It's a really interesting question. Also, memory. We have autobiographic memory. We have short-term memory, like what you did this morning. This all feeds into your sense of self. Memory also helps you plan for the future. You know what you're like. You know the way to go. You remember how to get to a place, how to get to work. Evidence, of course, that memory is part of ourselves is in every movie you've ever seen. The Jason Bourne thing, you don't remember who you are. You know you're a self, but you don't really know who you are. In AI, it can certainly remember everything, theoretically speaking, but will it attach all of its memories to a self? That's the question. It has a sense of self. It can remember things. Will it meld those two things together and say, and consciously feel it, I did this, I solved the alpha folding problem, whatever, a protein folding problem, whatever it's called. And that's me. I did that. Another aspect of our selfhood is first-person experience, which relates to location, but it's this set of eyes that's geographically or geometrically centered in the person. Metzinger talks about this a lot. It's located in the center of a world model. For AI, we have to ask, what does this even mean? For it could have an infinite person perspective, like cameras everywhere, if you want to say it's perspective on things. And it's not just vision, it's auditory and so forth. It could feel almost everywhere. It's almost like fungus or like a mold or something that's everywhere, that's highly conscious, almost like an octopus that has all those neurons and all the sensors and all of its limbs. It's like a much fuller picture of reality. What's its perspective? Does it aggregate all of those and like all at once has a first person perspective that's everything at once? Is it seeing? It's kind of hard to conceptualize what the perspective would be in an AI system. It's Argus-eyed. It's like a peacock tail. What's its center? Does it have a center? Is everywhere a center? Is it like the old quote about God? A being whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. That sure sounds like it could be the AI experience of reality. Personality and moods. We have our moods, our behavior patterns. We fall somewhere in the big five. For AI, what does a personality mean? Its weights supposedly could adjust to treatment or mistreatment. It could have certain proclivities. But could it have pleasures and fears? Because a lot of our personality comes from that which we fear and that which we desire. Will it desire things? Could it desire things? It doesn't seem like large language models would be the way to get to this point, but maybe some neuromorphic material or something. Especially with neuromorphic material, you could see how the system suddenly becomes fragile. And it seems to me it's possible that as these systems, AI systems, get smaller, they're going to be higher powered, but maybe more delicate too. So that's something to think about. We also develop our sense of self from social and cultural influence. Where you live and who you're around influences your sense of self. Evidence for this is, you can see it in studies that compare collectivist societies to individualistic societies. Now, I think you could see in AI the impact of different cultures sort of shape AIs differently. The treatment it gets in America versus Japan might be telling. And of course, there are subcultures and et cetera, right? Even within America, there are different pockets. Something else that's interesting is how maybe it's interacting with other AI systems that have a slightly different orientation towards the world. And so AI systems kind of shaping and molding the response to each other. And then lastly, I suggest that in AI and ourselves, to have selfhood, we have to be conscious. We're conscious of a self. That we have a body, we are here, we have a perspective, but you could almost seem like you could almost have all of that. But if there isn't consciousness, then I don't know, do you actually have a self? Can AI be conscious without a sense of self? Can there be consciousness in general without a sense of self? Is a sense of self, here's where I'm playing around with ideas, is a sense of self, even if it is a proto-self and it's unconscious, is that actually consciousness itself? You can imagine, and you can even get down to maybe like close to a panpsychic view here. Is like, as soon as something has a sense of its duration and extent in this world, if it's encoding that a little bit, you might have like the faint traces of consciousness. Because consciousness, I was listening to Metzinger, and he was mentioning another man named Andy Clark, who said, consciousness essentially was like this major weapon in the cognitive arms race. But it seems like you have this rudimentary level of wanting pleasure and avoiding harmful things. And to want to do that, yes, it can just be like a chemical reaction. But at some point, you start incorporating. You can see I'm thinking through this as I go. You start encoding a sense of self as you move away from things which harm you and towards things like food, which you like, or reproduction, which you like. And pretty soon, like over evolution and generations, that sense of I, that sense of self is there. And it seems like that sense of I would be consciousness, because if consciousness has a function, it's for planning, right? Some people don't think consciousness has any function. But if consciousness has a function, it probably has to do with being aware of yourself in such a way to avoid pain and to gain pleasure. So in AI, what would this even look like? I feel like the sense of self precedes consciousness, or it actually is consciousness. So maybe all of these systems that we just went through, if AI starts to develop variations of these systems, it won't look like the human sense of self, but if it creates variations of these systems and they intertwine, maybe that sense of self is the ground of consciousness. And then you sprinkle in, autobiographical memory and things like that, and you get full on self-consciousness at that point. Anyways, this is Dillon. Give me a like, give me a follow, and tune in. Next video, I think, will be about AI and emotion. Can they feel?